So some of the main reasons that we do have wrong convictions, and we still have not really fixed the system yet, and what you have to think about, if we do have a track record, however small that is, of convicting innocent people, particularly in the capital case, here are some of the reasons. One, eyewitness misidentification. Be surprised at how many cases are thrown out because the actual eyewitness was wrong. Two, false confessions. You have people that actually, when they go under pressure in the police processing, convict themselves, actually violate their own Fifth Amendment rights, and convict themselves. Three, jailhouse snitches, their testimony. Four, invalid forensics. I think in this documentary you talk about Nancy and her brother Greg, and part of that evidence used against him was bite marks. We don't even consider that science anymore. It's not even allowed in the courtroom anymore. That was used against him.
Long story, but ultimately, because the defense put on nothing, Greg was found guilty. My brother, Greg Wilhoit, was wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit. And my husband was a career Army officer, and we were living in Heidelberg, Germany at the time with our two young children. And my dad called me with the news that Greg, had in fact, I knew the trial was going on, but this was back in 1987. It was very expensive to call Germany, and you just didn't do that. And so when my dad called, I knew the trial was over. And he told me, he said, honey, I have bad news. He said they found Greg guilty. And of course I was just devastated. And then he followed it up with, and it's even worse than that. They have sentenced him to death. So that began my family's journey into trying to get Greg free. And then about 9 months later, very unexpectedly, he walked out the front door to go to work, and the Tulsa Police Department was there, and they arrested him and charged him with first-degree murder, and told him that the only real evidence that they had against him was a bite mark. Whoever had killed Kathy, my sister-in-law, had left a bite mark on her body. And they had these two expert witnesses who said that a bite mark was just like a fingerprint, and that Greg's bite, and no two alike, and that this bite mark absolutely matched Greg's teeth.
Key in the Wilhoit case was who performed the analysis. I remember watching an episode on 60 Minutes about this particular case. 60 Minutes or ABC, I don't remember who did the newscast, but the attorney that was successful in representing Greg Wilhoit in his defense at the appellate level stated that the original bite marks were analyzed by two dentists, not forensic odontologists, but dentists. Therefore, we're talking about people unqualified to do the analysis.
The thing that my parents had been asking repeatedly was to have another bite mark expert look at the bite mark, because all we had was what the prosecution was telling us. So after they fired those attorneys, my parents, the recommendation was that they get a local attorney, somebody from Pawhuska that would be familiar with the jury pool, and so they did. And they hired an attorney by the name of George Briggs, who was also one of the top defense attorneys in the state, or had been. And my parents, the first thing they asked him was, since it was 3 weeks before the trial was going to start, if he was going to ask for a continuance. And he said no, he didn't need to do that. He had it all under control. He could, handle all this. Well, unfortunately, it turned out that he was an alcoholic with brain damage from a number of falls that he had taken. He had actually been sanctioned by the Oklahoma Bar Association to not take any new cases, but he said later that he didn't open his mail, so he didn't know that. So he took the case. 3 weeks later, it went to trial, and he also had done absolutely nothing. We are in the middle of a first-degree murder trial. We need someone to look at this bite mark, and supposedly the attorneys have tried to find somebody and they haven't been able to, but can you help me? Within 30 minutes he called back, and he had found an expert up in Phillipsburg, Kansas, which is in northern Kansas, almost to Nebraska, who turned out to be the president of the American Board of Forensic Odontology, which is bite mark experts. He came to Tulsa on his own, looked at the bite mark, and said there was no possible way it was Greg's bite mark. He knew that for a fact, just eyeballing it. So he said, it's too late for me to testify as an expert witness, but he said, I can be in the courtroom, and when your attorney cross-examines the state's expert witnesses, I can at least give him some questions to ask. So he did that, and Greg's attorney refused to even talk to him. So he was then on death row in McAlester, and because my parents had spent their life savings, and because we had to sell Greg's house and everything, he qualified for a public defender from the Indigent Defense System in Oklahoma, and he was assigned to an attorney named Mark Barrett. And Mark turned out to be amazing, and if he'd had Mark to begin with, none of this would have happened. But Mark, in collaboration with Dr. Krause, who was the forensic odontologist, who was just appalled because he knew Greg hadn't done this, and the fact that this miscarriage of justice had taken place. So Mark and Dr. Krause worked together, sent the bite mark to the 12 top forensic odontologists in North America, and all of them sent back affidavits saying there was no possible way it was Greg's bite mark. But unfortunately, this took about 4 years. When Greg was actually sent to McAlester on death row, he was actually a proponent of the death penalty. He really believed, even though he was on the other end of the stick, as he used to say, he believed that if you committed the ultimate crime, you should pay the ultimate price. And just because, I'll quote him, but just because he was down there living amidst a bunch of murderers didn't, change his opinion. In 1989, I believe was the year, Oklahoma, the Supreme Court had put a moratorium on executions, and Oklahoma in 1989 was ready to start executing people again. And the first person that came up, for whatever reason, was Chuck Coleman, who was one of Greg's friends. And he said that they had it on TV, they were going to do it at midnight, they were kind of counting it down like New Year's Eve, and he was watching it on, he had a little TV that we were allowed to buy him, and he was watching it on TV, and he really thought he would not care when this happened. But when they came on and announced that Chuck Coleman, had, as Greg always said, been put down like a dog, instead of indifference, he was just overcome with grief, and he realized that the world was not a better place, a safer place, just because his friend, had been executed. And he did a complete 180-degree turn on the death penalty. On death row, they spend 23 hours a day in their cell, which is just a windowless box, and are allowed out in the yard 1 hour a day. For the first 6 months Greg was there, he chose not to go out in the yard at all. He really was not at all interested in socializing with his fellow condemned individuals, as he always said. But then, after about 6 months, Ron Williamson, who, I don't know if you're familiar with John Grisham's The Innocent Man, but he's the subject of that nonfiction book by John Grisham. But he was put in the cell directly across the run from Greg. And he and Ronnie became, well, they became best friends on death row.
We developed a friendship slowly over the years until we were like brothers.
Just about the break of day.
So they started taking their hour during the day to go out into the yard. But what was so bad was you never went anywhere when you were on death row without being handcuffed, belly chains, ankle chains, and part of your hour was they had to come in, put all the chains on you, you shuffled out to the yard, they unchained you, then you spent however much time you had in the yard, but then they had to allow time to chain you back up and, you know, take you back to your cell. Greg was granted what's called an evidentiary hearing back in Pawhuska because of evidence. Basically, no evidence was presented at the original trial. So we were able to bring in all the bite mark evidence. We were able to bring in our own expert witnesses. Plus, the other side of it was we were trying to show that George Briggs, his attorney, who had since passed away from cirrhosis, was ineffective counsel. And ultimately, that is what happened. It turned out that the two experts that the state had, the prosecution had, were not experts at all. One of them had not even been out of dental school a year. With our experts, the bite mark was totally disproven, and ultimately Greg was granted a new trial based on ineffective counsel. Greg chose Mark Barrett, the appellate attorney who had been working with him all these years, to be his attorney in the second trial. And they retried the case. The prosecution put their case on again, which was absolutely nothing because they didn't have the bite mark, and now it's 8 years later. Now it's 1993, and this happened in '85. And after they put on their case, Mark Barrett asked for what's called a directed verdict of innocence, which means that the prosecution did not meet the burden of proof, and the judge granted it. The defense didn't even have to put on their case. You know, it's just the same as being found not guilty by a jury, except the judge didn't even make the jury hear it, which again we don't think has ever happened in a death penalty case anywhere else. So Greg was now a free man.
The bottom teeth you can see here and here of Greg Wilhoit.
My attorney asked the judge for a motion of directed verdict of innocence, which means that the prosecution did not meet their burden of proof. We came back from lunch. The judge says, the defense request is granted. Mr. Wilhoit, you're free to go home. This case is over. It was just such an emotional, uplifting moment. I felt like I was soaring almost. It was just like an emotional burden that I've been carrying around for like 10 years was just lifted, just like that.
He was really struggling mentally. I mean, literally, he had lost everything. I mean, not only had he lost his wife, he lost his children, raised the opportunity to raise his children, because even once he was out of prison, he was not financially or emotionally or, you know, able to take the kids back. And he lost his livelihood. He lost his physical, his mental health, he lost his home. I mean, he literally lost everything. When you're exonerated, the state gives you absolutely nothing. I mean, literally nothing. They just say, oh, they don't even say sorry, but they just say, okay, bye, you know, you're free to go. 2003, Oklahoma had passed a bill for compensation for people who were wrongfully convicted. And it said that the maximum that somebody could get was $175,000. And I was just so excited and so naive. I just thought, oh my gosh, you know, this would be huge for Greg. I mean, he's trying to live just on Social Security disability. But what we discovered was that the way the legislation is written, it says either a person has to be pardoned by either the governor or the Pardon and Parole Board, or they have to have been declared by a court actually innocent, factually innocent. Well, Mark Barrett was involved again, and he decided that the pardon route would be the way to go. So he went to the Pardon and Parole Board, presented Greg's case, and they came back and said that you can't pardon somebody that's not guilty of anything, which sort of makes sense, but that's how the legislation's written. So they said, can't help you. So then he decided to go the actual innocence route. Well, we went all the way up through the Oklahoma court system. They said that because those exact words were not used at Greg's trial, which in 1993 they weren't used. They were trying to hold us to a standard now that didn't even exist in 1993 when Greg was exonerated. But anyway, we had to go all the way to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and they finally, the Supreme Court finally said that they felt like the intent of the legislation was not to punish somebody who was exonerated before that became a common term. So they basically said that Greg was eligible to continue pursuing it. They weren't guaranteeing he'd get any money, but the other courts were saying he isn't even eligible at all. So that gave us a little bit of hope. But unfortunately, the state continued to fight us every step of the way, and ultimately Greg did get a very, very small settlement from the state. But he, but you know, because he did get that very small settlement, he had actually remarried, and he was able to go back to California a little over a year ago. My parents had bought him a little house to live in Sacramento, so he went back a little over a year ago, but unfortunately on Valentine's Day of this year, 2014, he passed away very unexpectedly in his home. So it's been a tough year, and I think the thing that breaks my heart more than anything else is that my hope through all these years, and it's been almost 30 years now since Kathy was killed, I just wanted somebody in the state of Oklahoma to say they were sorry. And that never happened. And that's just very, very wrong.